Alright, well, today we're going to continue our discussions on the Progressive Era. Look at the temperance movement, socialism, the Panama Canal, the ideas of dollar diplomacy, the Progressive Party, sometimes called the Bull Moose Party, and the New Freedom, Woodrow Wilson, the Federal Reserve Act, the Clayton Antitrust Act, the Keating-Owen Act, and the 16th and 17th Amendments. Now, part of the Progressive Era was America's expansion into world affairs. The nation gradually becoming a dominant power, particularly after the Spanish-American War. You had Theodore Roosevelt, who was a great activist and believed in expanding American power, but in this area also had the idea of trying to expand American ideals as well. And some of these attempts were more successful than others. For example, Theodore Roosevelt's open door policy in China believed that all nations should be treated equally. All nations should have the right to participate in China, but overlooking the problem of Chinese sovereignty. China was an independent country, but everyone was ignoring what they were doing. While America gradually became more engaged in the Western Hemisphere, problems persisted in the Eastern Hemisphere, sometimes some problems with Europe, but also relations with Japan, particularly because of what was happening on the West Coast. Japanese and Chinese immigrants had become a special target of a lot of anti-immigrant activists, which really started seeing its rise in the 1880s. Remember, the warning laws limiting what prohibiting discrimination, so Chinese laborers and Japanese laborers paid way less than what native-born American laborers were paid. In fact, the first attempts to regulate, among the first attempts to regulate immigration in the 1880s were laws trying to ban Chinese and Japanese immigration. The Japanese government was very upset at how Japanese Americans were being treated in the United States. For example, California passed a series of laws in the early 1900s that limited the immigration of Japanese labor in the city of San Francisco. Ironically, one of the most liberal cities in the country today, 1906 passed a series of laws segregating Asian school children from white children in San Francisco schools. So this caused some problems between the United States and Japan. Anti-Chinese leagues have been in place for years in the West, and a series of anti-Asian riots had erupted in San Francisco. So keep in mind, race relations were not a priority in the Progressive movement. There were some people pushing for them, but very, very few. Except most people were still very conservative on reactionary on race relations, preferring a system of Jim Crow white supremacy. Depending on who you were, where you were at, and how bad the conditions were. The conditions against African Americans were their worst in the Deep South. But the West, Native Americans and Asians were the particular targets. Portions of the Northeast, it's mostly the Irish are targets, the Italians, basically immigrants coming into the United States. But it continued to be a particular problem during the Progressive Era. Conservatives at the time period were absolutely adamant in trying to maintain a system of white supremacy, and many progressives simply were just not interested in the plight of civil rights at this point. But another issue on foreign policy, though, was the Panama Canal. You see, for centuries, many people have been dreaming of a transoceanic canal connecting the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. Because up to this point, ships going from the eastern shores of America or from Europe going to go to Asia, they had to go all the way around South America and across the Pacific to get there. I'd say cutting through North America at its thinnest point would save weeks off their journey and save shipping companies tons of money. So the target was Central America. So we'll say this is Central America here. This is Nicaragua. South America. Costa Rica and Panama. Go to your books on pages. I'm sorry, I'll stop, of course, further north, but Costa Rica and Panama. El Salvador's back here, sorry. The idea is to get across the Atlantic to the Gulf of Mexico, to the Pacific Ocean. But you got to dig through all this earth here first. Now, France had attempted to build a canal across Panama in the late 1800s, but disease and high expense drove the construction company into bankruptcy. So they're only about 40% complete when they're finally just driven into bankruptcy and couldn't finish it. Another idea had been a Nicaraguan canal, which is not so far-fetched. It's the plan was here to dig a canal across the Pacific here to this lake here, Lake Managua, and a canal down here to the San Jose River and dredge it to the Atlantic. So basically, canal be going through here. The problem, though, with the Nicaraguan canal was the navigable lakes and streams and the were there, but problems are a lot of geologic problems. So the geology is unstable. There's a lot of earthquakes in the area, causing a lot of landslides, causing a lot of disruptions to these plans. So it's just simply unfeasible and inadvisable to construct a large canal here in Nicaragua. Now, in 1901, Theodore Roosevelt arranged the Hague-Pauncefote Treaty, which canceled an 1850 agreement between the United States and Great Britain. Basically, America and Britain agreed in 1850 they're going to go in together and build a canal, but by 1901, Roosevelt says the U.S. will build this canal alone. It's going to be an entirely American project. So, Theodore Roosevelt is concentrating on Panama for the construction of this canal. At the turn of the century, you have heavy moving equipment, steam shovels, so forth, making a job like that much more feasible and a lot easier. The thing is, Colombia still controlled Panama, and they're not, and they're driving a really hard bargain on negotiations for the Panama Canal. Now, Colombian Charge d'Affaires, Thomas Harran, negotiated with American diplomats over the possibility of a canal. So the deal agreed to a 6-mile wide canal zone. It's basically 3 miles on either side of the canal. in exchange for $10 million to Columbia and an annual rent of about $250,000 a year. Now, of course, many ships coming through there that it paid for itself very quickly and very easily. Well, this is a good deal for the United States, but a very bad deal for Colombia. Colombia thought it was getting cheated. The Colombian government refuses to honor the agreement, rejects it outright. Colombia is demanding $20 million and a share of payment to the French. They still owed them a bunch of money from this earlier canal project. So the U.S. is kind of out in the cold here. Well, in comes French engineer Felipe Buenavarea. He'd been one of the key engineers on the earlier canal project. And he's willing to help the U.S. circumvent Colombia. The U.S. wants this original deal because it's a really good deal for them, and Buenavarea, he wants the canal completed. And he knows the people of Panama very well. So they realized the best way, Panama being part of Colombia was subject to a lot of horrible civil wars. Say half a dozen since it won independence just barely a century before. And say in another civil war just ended just a few years earlier, leaving about 100,000 people dead across Colombia, and Colombia's very weak at this point. Panamanians won independence. So in November 1903, Buenavarea helped organize and finance the revolution in Panama, after several previous attempts had failed. But this time, the U.S. ends up landing troops at from the USS Nashville, a American battleship, as the new revolution erupted in 1903. The U.S. sent in a warship to send in troops to basically protect and maintain order and cut off any reinforcements from Colombia. So that way the Panamanians are able to effectively win their independence because Colombia couldn't put down the revolution. Now, the U.S. recognizes Panamanian independence. The U.S. turns around and gets the deal to the Panama Canal Zone on the original terms. So they just had to take Panama away from Colombia to do it. So the project went through a series of locks and dams crisscrossing Panama. Interesting enough, the entrance from the Atlantic side is further west than the Pacific entrance, just because of everything curves around the geology. But thousands of men, many long, hard years of work. Panama Canal is completed in 1914. It's considered to be one of the engineering marvels of all time, basically digging this canal from one end of the ocean to the other, from one ocean to the other. So it was extraordinarily successful, ships going back and forth through it for many years. The U.S. made a nice little profit off of it, but over the years, though, Latin America was increasingly upset about American presence and interference in Central and South America. Panama wanted to control the Panama Canal. And as time went on, the Panama Canal kind of becoming a victim of its own success. It was shipping, a lot of ships were simply becoming too big to fit through the canal. Modern American aircraft supercarriers are simply just too big to fit through it. So by 1979, President Jimmy Carter agreed to return the canal zone to Panama, if the United States would finally do so at the end of 1999. So the Panama Canal. On a side note, the turn of the century is a great period in aeronautics. In 1895, a Massachusetts schoolteacher named Robert Goddard successfully built the first successful liquid fuel rocket. Small, but it worked. ushering in the age of rocketry. December 1903, Kitticock, North Carolina, the Wright brothers, Orville and Wilbur Wright, conducted the first successful flight of a heavier-than-air aircraft. So lighter-than-air aircraft have been around for a long time, since the 1780s, and actually were used as observation posts of war, that's hot air balloons. The first successful takeoff and landing of a heavier-than-air aircraft was the Wright brothers. December 1903, Kitticock, North Carolina. So there are others that were trying at the same time, but they could never quite get the aircraft to take off or land very well. A lot of crash landings. But interestingly enough, on the story of the Wright brothers, 1909, Theodore Roosevelt, his sense of adventure, embarked on another presidential first. He became the first president flying an airplane. It's a primitive craft, a little more than the wings with an engine strapped on the back, but Roosevelt was the first, and he loved every minute of it. Now we go to the election of 1908. Now, Roosevelt had promised during the 1904 campaign not to seek another term as president. He could do so if he wanted to. The 22nd Amendment, which limited presidents to 2 elected terms, did not go into effect until 1951. Interestingly enough, the 22nd Amendment said that the vice president can serve at least 2 years the remaining term of the original president on to be elected twice more in his own right, giving your president a possible 10 years. But Theodore Roosevelt, though, decided to stick to his word, and it's popular enough at the time that he could effectively name his successor. So he names Secretary of War William Howard Taft as his successor. And Republicans get him the nomination fairly easily. Picture of him here on page 729. Taft was a friendly man, a close friend of Roosevelt, fellow reformer, but Taft himself never been too keen on seeking the presidency. His lifelong ambition was to be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, but his wife pushed him in more ambitious directions. The party bosses, though, were far more conservative than Roosevelt and his progressive followers. The progressives had hoped to have a convention adopt their platform of reform, but the conservatives settled Taft, the conservative vice president, James S. Sherman, and built a very conservative platform regarding the courts, labor, and other issues around Taft. The Democrats went with William Jennings Bryan for a third time. And the results about the same, and Taft ended up winning fairly easily, 51.6% of the popular vote, 321 electoral votes. Bryan gets 43.1%, 162 electoral votes. Eugene Debs is runs again as a socialist candidate, and getting 2.8% of the vote, another 420,000 votes. A small but steady following. And the Prohibition candidate, Eugene W. Chapin, rounds out the rest. 1.7% of the vote, or about 250,000 votes. So it goes to Taft. Well, Taft wasn't a very good public speaker, but very amiable. He enjoyed playing golf, playing bridge. Enjoyed good food and lying around, but enjoyed good food and lying around maybe a little too much. He's the heaviest president in U.S. history, close to 300 pounds. In fact, they had installed a special bathtub over the White House because he so big he actually got stuck in the bathtub one night. But he once said, quote, "I don't like politics. I don't like the limelight." Roosevelt, in the meantime, went on safari. He went to Europe, met Kaiser and the Pope. Basically, he's touring the world, having the time of his life. Now, where Roosevelt had interest in maintaining world stability, particularly expanding American influence, that is, the big stick policy. Speaking softly here, big stick. The Taft administration, however, is much more interested in extending American economic influence overseas. Taft's Secretary of State, Philander C. Knox, who had been the Attorney General under Roosevelt, Lander who indicated that. Knox, remember, was a corporate attorney. Though he busted up a few trusts, he's still interested in supporting corporations in general. And Knox wanted to extend American investments into less developed areas. So critics started referring to task foreign policy as dollar diplomacy. Now, this policy faced considerable problems in the Far East. For example, in 1905, Roosevelt made an agreement with Japan in 1905 that the U.S. would limit its investments in Manchuria, that is, northeastern China. Japan had its eyes on Manchuria for some time, and it's made it a lot easier since they now occupied Korea. But American bankers persuaded Taft to abandon this policy, and Knox worked to build a consortium of Western powers that helped build railroads in China, making them all very nice with the profit process. But when Europe agreed, Knox moved to include Japan from the Manchurian railroad investment. So Japan responded by making overtures to Russia about a similar deal. Basically, Timothy Cook stirring the pot, the whole deal collapsed. Now, in the Caribbean, Taft expanded Roosevelt's policies limiting European influence in building American stature in the region. That should be a map in your book here. Page 705, see the map of American interests in the Caribbean, late 1800s, early 1900s. Accelerated under Taft. U.S. began investing very heavily in Latin American markets, which meant U.S. is now all of a sudden, they have a lot of interest in all these different countries. And companies are very interested in trying to maintain their profit margin at whatever the cost. That's for that own country. You have governments being overthrown in some areas, new governments being elected democratically, freely and fairly. Start instituting policies that are damaging the profit margins of some of these American companies, and they pushed to overthrow the government. Example here happened in 1909 in Nicaragua. In 1909, American Mining Company inspired a group of insurgents to overthrow the government after the Nicaraguan government was threatening to nationalize the mines, that is, take over the mines directly, have direct ownership by the government. So all these profits this American mining company is making there weren't staying in Nicaragua. All these profits, every last dime was going back to the United States. People in Nicaragua were seeing nothing for all this wealth their land had. So in response to this overthrow of the government, a freely elected government, the Taft administration sent American troops to seize customs houses to make sure the money was still coming through. And after the revolution, American bankers were encouraged to make cheap loans to prop up the regime. And in 1911, so here they sent troops in to put down a rebellion against the American-backed government. And those troops remained there for 10 more years. Long occupation throughout the 1920s. Panama was a protectorate until 1939 because of the Panama Canal. Cuba's troops were sent out on numerous occasions to try to put down uprisings against the government, or to make sure that American-backed governments friendly to American corporate interests were protected. I think interests like the Dominican Republic and Haiti and so forth. Almost every country in Latin America had some kind of American intervention at one time or another. Meanwhile, back in the United States, back to the idea of the Prohibition movement, a lot of reformers remain concerned about the problem of alcoholism in the United States. So the problems America faces with drug and alcohol addiction in the 21st century, existed in the 19th century as well, and in the 20th century. People were very concerned about this problem and determined to do something about it. Now, many were already pushing for banning the sale of alcohol and formed their own political party for this, the Prohibitionist Party. Now, so understand, there's a difference between temperance and prohibition. Now, temperance is about pushing for individuals to abstain, individual abstinence from alcohol. Prohibition was interested in a full legal ban, making it illegal for everybody. State and local levels are steadily gaining ground. Many cities and counties have voted to go dry. States were restricting alcohol sales. More politicians becoming receptive to problems of prohibition. You have these wet and dry elections in these areas. Wet meant all alcohol is legal. Dry meant alcohol is illegal. All sales were legal, but there might be some age restrictions, but those really don't come along until after prohibition. Dry alcohol is illegal. You can't buy beer, wine, or anything else. So, but you have damp, those kind of in between, which meant just kind of lighter alcohol, like beer and wine sales were legal, or some sales legal under certain circumstances. Just kind of in between wet and dry. Now, Former solved the serious problem with alcohol is causing. Caused a lot of health problems for people. They were severe alcoholics. It caused people to drink away their paychecks and face financial ruin. Caused violence, bar fights, and people drinking, coming home from the bar, sitting home drinking all day, beating up their wives and their kids. And employers saw it cause drops in productivity as well. People showing to work drunk. People too drunk to operate machinery, causing accidents, and so forth. So people are thinking, if you made alcohol illegal, you would solve all the problems associated with it. The Women's Christian Temperance Union was one of the leaders of this movement. It attracted 250,000 members by 1911. Concert with the Anti-Saloon League that made alcohol in saloons illegal in 19 states by 1916. Through the moral crusades of World War I, anti-German sentiments, since Germans are so closely connected with beer, that helped the 18th Amendment pass, taking effect in 1920. The 18th Amendment is prohibition. The furious lobbying on behalf of brewers and other groups failed to stop the tide. Former saw prohibition as a major step in eliminating social evils and moral wrongs. We'll talk about prohibition more in the next section. The 18th Amendment was later repealed. But along with this, it's not just alcohol, it's also drug abuse. Drug addiction is a major source of concern. In the late 1800s, you had opiates. Derivatives of the opium plant. These are the best form of painkillers available for patients suffering from severe pain, for performing surgery. Basically used most commonly in medicine. Now, some other forms of anesthetic, be like ether, basically this little anesthetic dust that be kind of sprinkled over patients' noses. Actually, they inhaled it in, caused them to fall unconscious. But the problem with the ether was all this dust flying around. You had the anesthesiologists or the doctors would inhale it, and they'd fall unconscious too. But another problem with ether was it's highly flammable. If you're in an operating room with open flames, such as a Bunsen burner or a gas furnace for heat, especially in winter, it cause an explosion. So it's very dangerous. So opiates are used to cure problems of pain and for surgery. Here's the problem: is doctors didn't fully understand the nature of addiction at this time and the true nature of many of the substances they were prescribing. And this is before the Pure Food and Drug Act, before these medicines were put on, were studied for their side effects. Doctors were looking for something to cure pain, so opiates did the job. They're looking for something that will put patients unconscious during surgery. It did the job, but yet they didn't quite understand how does addiction work. They're aware of it, they know it exists, but how does it start? Why are some people addicted and others not? Well, one of the common forms of opiate was morphine. It's regularly prescribed for pain, put in medicines. In fact, it's often sold over the counter, put in cough medicine and everything else. Laudanum was a common over-the-counter painkiller sold. It's a mixture of morphine and alcohol. Except turn your lights dim. But again, openly sold over the counter. And a lot of people got addicted to it. Well, morphine is commonly used during the Civil War for patients during surgery, for patients recovering from amputations and things like that, very painful procedures, and also recovery from other post-operative procedures. But the problem was a lot of soldiers got addicted to morphine during the Civil War. In fact, in the years after the Civil War, the 1870s, the condition was morphine addiction was often called the soldier's disease. Soldier's disease because it's most commonly associated with those who got addicted to morphine recovering from their wartime injuries. So, doctors are trying to find a cure for morphine addiction. How are they going to do that? So, they decide they're going to come up with a substitute for morphine. So, in the 1880s, cocaine was invented. Part of the opiate class. It's designed to combat morphine addiction. It was to believed to be a salubrious substance. It was prescribed as a painkiller, mixed in with medicines, and special ingredient of the health drink introduced in the late 1800s, Coca-Cola. In fact, it had cocaine in it. Cocoa was this, but by 1895, cocoa was replaced as the key ingredient in Coca-Cola. So the original formula of Coke isn't quite the original formula. But she had others, like some openings called Cocaine Cola. It's a health drink with a bunch of cocaine in it. But for all the problems with cocaine, while it solved morphine addiction, what it ended up doing was making patients addicted to cocaine instead. It's even more addictive and even more dangerous than morphine. So chemists tried to find safer alternatives. The Bayer Company in 1895 introduced aspirin as a mild pain reliever. It's a very useful, very safe substance, but it's only a mild pain relief. Severe pain they're trying to deal with cocaine. Trying to treat with cocaine and morphine, well, aspirin just isn't enough. Well, Bayer's moving to solve that problem too. So in 1898, they developed a very promising new drug that promises to be an effective painkiller and solve all the problems of morphine and cocaine addiction. So they patented in 1898, sold it under the brand name of heroin. And proved to be turned out heroin is the most dangerous of the three. Within 20 years, there are more than 200,000 people in the United States alone who were heroin addicts. And the same problems of overdoses, serious health problems you see with heroin today. You see, you got the basic problems with some of these drugs. Is, for example, cocaine. Cocaine is a coagulant. It causes the blood to clot the bloodstream. And so what happens is people taking cocaine is blood clotting their bloodstream. They could have a massive heart attack right on the spot, or blood clot flows to the brain, stroke. So you can have people prime of their lives, perfectly good health, taking cocaine, and suddenly dying of a massive heart attack or a stroke, being basically living the rest of their lives as a vegetable. 1980s, there was a college basketball star, Len Bias, top pick for the NBA, one of the best basketball players in the country. Early 20s, excellent physical health, took cocaine, massive heart attack, and died. Next, problem with heroin, very addictive. Big potential for overdoses. And the problem is completely unsafe for human consumption. They just could not find a safe dose for heroin. So what happens is, as the more dangerous effects of these drugs are known, their use was strictly relegated to prescription through permission of a doctor, but only on very special circumstances. Only certain doctors can even prescribe it, and the federal government only, or they just outright banned completely, particularly heroin. Bayer, no doubt, the heroin business very quickly. And this day, the U.S. still struggles with problems of drug addiction. Well, we have another issue, drug issue, lithium. Now, lithium, of course, is a common antidepressant. In fact, it was once the active ingredient in 7-Up. It's packaged under the slogan, takes the ouch out of grouch. In fact, lithium was included in 7-Up up until the early 1940s. In fact, some cities even put lithium in their drinking water supplies, a process called lithiation. Interesting thing they found about cities that put high levels of lithium in their drinking water was they witnessed declines in violent crime. Population was calmer, less anxious, less depressed because of lithiation. But this practice also ceased in the early 1940s because of health concerns and the fact that local leaders decided that it probably wasn't a good idea to keep doping up the population like that. Now, socialism. This is another big issue in the progressive era. Socialism really getting the height of its influence in the United States. Now, the period from 1900 to 1914 is the most radical in American history. Never did such widespread criticism of the free market system gather so much criticism many were poor and desperate. And the Socialist Party, although never a threat to the existing political order, essentially a curiosity, marked up several victories here. Now understand, there's a difference between socialism and communism. Communism calls for a violent overthrow of the government, a constant state of revolution to produce a socialist state. Socialism is an outcome for communism. Communism itself is a constant system of violence and oppression to produce socialism. Socialism itself, there's a mixture of it. Basically, it's a belief that government's taking over large industries. Sometimes government control of property and the distribution of wealth. Now, urban immigrants, particularly Germans and Jews, were attracted to it. Some women reformers are attracted to socialism because of its professed pacifism and labor militancy. And farmers in the South and Midwest are also attracted to socialism as well. Basically, they've given up on the free enterprise system, believe that socialism was the only answer. That is, in many cases, it promised farmers to maintain control of their farms, but government takeovers of those industries which had been harassing them economically for so long. Government takeovers of the railroads, the telegraph lines, warehouses, and banks, so they could finally get a fair shake. That finally all these big businesses would finally be answerable to the people. Back to areas of East Texas and southern Oklahoma became hotbeds of socialist activity. After 1,000 socialists won election to state and local offices, Milwaukee elected a couple of socialist mayors. Several socialist legislators elected states across the country. Socialist city council members, even a couple of socialist members of Congress. Like I said, Bernie Sanders of Vermont, a U.S. senator and a independent, is a socialist. In fact, interestingly enough, states like Texas, you had the socialists actually outpolling the Republicans. But because the state voted 90% Democratic, socialists getting 5 or 6 or 7% of the vote versus 3 or 4% for Republicans. Like I said, yes, technically gaining second, but not gaining much ground. Now, there's a mix of socialism exists. Some believe in pure Marxism, as government ownership of absolutely everything. Ownership of all farms, all property, everything. Others believe only in nationalization of large industries, allowing small businesses and independent farms to survive. And this strain of socialism attracted farmers who had so much trouble with banks and railroads. But the Socialist Party, being pacifist, believing war was wrong, the refusal to support America in World War I severely damaged its standing in the United States. They declined precipitously after the war. However, in Europe, those socialist parties supported the war efforts in their countries and ended up becoming significant political powers after World War I. But Taft ends up breaking with Roosevelt, which causes a lot of problems in the progressive movement, particularly in the Republican Party. Taft, although Roosevelt's successor, always been rather restrained. Taft proved to be steadily more conservative administration than Roosevelt preferred, sometimes refusing to appoint several Roosevelt's more favored people for cabinet positions. Taft went over several trusts, including U.S. Steel, the one which had really been Carnegie Steel, but was bought out. But some of these trusts, however, Roosevelt had gone along with in gentlemen's agreements. That is, Roosevelt had given his word that if they just changed a few of their practices, that the federal government would leave them alone. But Taft turns around and goes after these same trusts anyway, which embarrasses Roosevelt. It's like it was an insult on his word. So Roosevelt really valued his integrity. And there's debate over the tariff ensuing. It's lowered enough, but not enough to suit progressives. In fact, the new Payne-Aldrich tariff, which was passed during the Taft administration, well, it lowered the tariff in some areas, increased it in others. Progressives are causing still more problems with trade. But it seemed, though, the country was crying reform and Taft was saying no. He pleased the conservatives in his party at the expense of the progressives. In fact, Taft enraged conservationists when he replaced James R. Garfield as Secretary of the Interior with Richard Ballinger, who was a corporate lawyer. And Ballinger attempted to invalidate Roosevelt's attempt to take over 1 million acres of forest and mineral reserves out of the public domain for private development. So the head of the Forest Service, Gifford Pinchot, learned that Ballinger had apparently tried to turn over public coal lands in Alaska to a private syndicate, allegedly for personal profit. That is, not only trying to take this stuff out of these resources, these forests, these lands out of federal protection, but Ballinger is basically trying to make money off all these lands by taking them out of the public domain. The investigation cleared Ballinger, but progressive stuff at Pinchot, as he continued providing his evidence and kept speaking out against Ballinger. That's also fostered breach in the Republican Party between progressives and conservatives. This whole fight between Ballinger and Pinchot over public lands and the accusations of corruption, of Ballinger's corruption. So all this is going into the 1912 election. Now, in 1911, Theodore Roosevelt announced he was going to seek a third term on a very progressive platform, one he called the New Nationalism. And that's Roosevelt's idea, his proposed platform. Now, the New Nationalism called for such things as the minimum wage, women's suffrage, unemployment insurance, the abolition of child labor, and old age pensions, basically a system similar to Social Security. Called it the New Nationalism. Well, the direct presidential primaries of the Republican campaign only 6 states, and Roosevelt won all of them. Basically, when it's a decision for the party faithful, Roosevelt won every time. But when they get to the convention, though, there are 254 disputed delegates between Taft and Roosevelt. And so the guys running the convention, the Rules Committee, the Credentials Committees, are run by conservatives who did not like Roosevelt. So the conservative old guard ended up awarding most of the delegates to Taft, ensuring him with a nomination. So Taft gets the nomination, renominated for the Republican Party for president. Roosevelt, enraged, feeling he had been cheated out of his nomination, breaks away and mounts a third party run under the Progressive Party ticket. And there's a picture of that here as well, page 731. Basically, it's a political party designed to promote Roosevelt's 1912 run. At the their convention, Roosevelt said he felt as strong as a bull moose, which gave the Progressive Party, this Progressive Party, the name the Bull Moose Party. But this party is going to come and go with Roosevelt's 1912 run. There's going to be other progressive parties that are going to be very different. So, Theodore Roosevelt, his third party run for the on the Progressive Party ticket. Basically, on his New Nationalism platform. Now, the Democrats won control of Congress in 1910. They're delighted with their prospects. The Republican Party split right down the middle. So they ended up nominating New Jersey Governor and Progressive Woodrow Wilson. What's interesting about Wilson, born in Stanton, Virginia, just before the Civil War, Wilson grew up in Georgia and was educated at Princeton University. He eventually became a professor of political science at Princeton. In fact, he's the first president in American history with a PhD. I'd say he goes from professor to becoming president of the university, and sees a lot of changes in the university, making it a lot more egalitarian in how the students are treated. In fact, Grover Cleveland had been a trustee of Princeton University during those years, and he worked very closely with Cleveland, got to know him very well. Well, in 1910, Wilson is elected governor of New Jersey on a very progressive platform. He attacks trusts in the state, institutes a lot of reforms, becomes a very popular figure across the country. And when he gets the nomination by the Democrats, he's calling the election a fight for what he called a second Emancipation Proclamation. This one to free all the people from the clutches of big business and corruption. Wilson called for a return of competition to businesses. He liked small business. One laws to what he said, to protect the man on the make rather than the men who's already made. And he worried that Roosevelt's brand of progressivism would make workers ward the state. That is simply too many programs and we felt there were too many handouts. Well, Roosevelt realized this configuration of the election. He didn't have a chance, but he campaigned furiously anyway. And across the country to big crowds. In fact, by October 1912, he's about to give this one speech in Milwaukee. He's got a speech shoved in his coat pocket. He's shaking hands, going up to the platform, waving to the crowd, when this man jumps out from the crowd and shoots Roosevelt right in the chest. Roosevelt had this big speech in his pocket, and the padding kind of blocks some of the blow of the bullet, but even though Roosevelt's been shot in the chest, and realizes shot in the chest, bleeding profusely, Roosevelt gives the speech anyway. Speaks for about 30 minutes to crowds, asked them to be quiet because he said he'd just been shot, but the big smile of his he always has said, "It'll take more than that to kill a bull moose." Turned out to be his last speech of the campaign. Spent the rest of the campaign in the hospital. He felt that everything was worth it. Well, Wilson and Roosevelt are both claiming to be radicals. In fact, this is the only time in American history you have the two major candidates claiming to be radicals. Both basically very reform-minded. Wilson claims that he too is a radical, but denounces Roosevelt and ends up winning in the triangulated elections. You can see here on page 735. Picture of Wilson here on page 734 speaking to a crowd. The election results here at 735. Wilson ends up winning 41.9% of the popular vote, 435 electoral votes. Wilson, as you can see, sweeps across the South, getting large portions of the West, the Midwest, and even portions of New England. Roosevelt comes in second with 27.4% of the vote. He gets 88 electoral votes. Roosevelt wins California, Washington, some of the upper Midwest, states like South Dakota, Minnesota, Michigan, Pennsylvania. Taft comes in third with 23.2% of the votes. He gets just 8 electoral votes. Taft wins just Utah and Vermont. But Vermont in those days was very strongly Republican. But this is the worst showing ever for a Republican. But in fact, because of this triangulated election, Wilson was able to win because the country is still very much leaning towards Republicans in general this time, either the conservative or the progressive brand of it. Not so much toward Democrats, but Wilson briefly shifts that back over toward the Democratic direction. Moving down the ballot here, Eugene Debs won 6% of the vote, over 900,000 electoral votes. In fact, this really is the high watermark for socialism in the United States, getting 900,000 votes. Let's see. They'll be declining considerably after that. Prohibitionists, again with Chapin. Prohibition Party gets the rest at 1.4% of the vote. So it goes to Wilson. But again, don't feel too bad about Taft. After his defeat, he realizes his long-standing dream and was appointed Chief Justice of the Supreme Court by President Warren Harding in 1921. Taft served as Chief Justice until 1930. But now the Wilson administration. His domestic policy agenda was called the New Freedom. Wilson's domestic policy agenda. And now basically he's inheriting the mantle of progressive from William Jennings Bryan on the Democratic side, and progressives more looking to Wilson to push forward an agenda of reform. During his first term, he established such things as the Federal Trade Commission, again to make sure that businesses are being conducted honestly and that such things as truth in advertising. The Clayton Antitrust Act is passed in 1913. The Clayton Antitrust Act strengthens the Sherman Antitrust Act, basically giving the federal government more power to go after, combat, break up trusts and monopolies. which the Wilson administration took on a great deal of energy trying to break up these large monopolies. And he lowered the tariffs, which felt would be a great boon to American business overseas. 2 amendments were ratified in 1913. The 16th Amendment called for the graduated income tax. Now, income taxes have been in effect off and on since the Civil War, basically trying to find different ways to bring in money for the federal government. But the 16th Amendment said that the income tax would be legal. Because there had been some criticism of previous attempts for income taxes because of apportionment. That is, some congressional districts, people were wealthier than in others. And because of the graduated income tax, some congressional districts would be sending in more money than others. For example, here in Arkansas, the 4th Congressional District, South Arkansas, is a very poor area. But compare that to, say, the 3rd Congressional District of Texas, it's the Dallas suburbs, very wealthy suburbs. They'll be sending in more income taxes than the 4th District would in Arkansas. And so the 16th Amendment takes away that, saying that the federal government does have the power to institute income taxes. Back in 1913, the first income tax was set up this way. It taxed 1% on incomes over $4,000, which in today's money would be about $80,000, $85,000, early 21st century. And it staircased up to a rate of 6% on incomes over $500,000. So most Americans actually didn't even have to pay the income tax because they simply didn't make enough money. Like say, on the $500,000 plus a year, those would be the multi-millionaires. Those make easily over $10 million a year. 17th Amendment was passed as well, ratified. It was the old populist idea, the direct election of senators. That is, the people's voice would be heard clearly over the state legislators. That is, the people would be selecting their own U.S. senators, not state legislators, but the people directly. The people, they believed, had a right to have their voice heard above all others. So, direct election goes into effect. We've been voting for our U.S. senators ever since. This year, 2016, there's a U.S. Senator election up this year as well. Wilson also institutes a number of changes. For example, he starts delivering State of the Union addresses in person for Congress. Now, Presidents Washington and Adams had done this initially, delivering the required report required by the Constitution on the State of the Union to be delivered to Congress. Washington and Adams did this in person. Jefferson did this a couple of times, but decided he didn't like really speaking in public, so he just simply sent written reports to Congress, which constituted the State of the Union. Actually, every president after that would do so, but Wilson brings this back, delivering the State of the Union address in person. And once you have the advent of radio in the 1920s and TV by the late 40s and early 50s, presidents continue to do so because it would be their opportunity to face the nation directly and present their proposed agenda for the coming year to Congress and the people. Now, Wilson had pushed through a lot of legislation that some proposals did not pass. One effort that did pass was the Keating-Owen Act of 1960. This is a ban on child labor. However, corporations were incensed in this attempt to try to keep children from working in mines and factories, and so they actually took the case all the way to the Supreme Court to try to overturn it. In 1918, the Supreme Court overturned the Keating-Owen Act in the case Hammer versus Degenhardt, calling it improper intrusion on local labor conditions. Well, in turn, Congress passes the Second Child Labor Act of 1919. in trying to ban child labor, but only to have it overturned by the Supreme Court in 1922. But it was not until 1938 Congress finally passed legislation that's able to deal with child labor, finally banning it for good. But there were some successful pieces of legislation. 1916, the Adamson Act was passed. This act called for an 8-hour workday for all interstate railroad workers. The Workmen's Compensation Act of 1960, an early attempt to provide compensation and support for workers who were too injured to work. But workers' comp was strictly directed for federal workers. Next, an important one, and also another important one, the Federal Highway Act of 1960. Cars are steadily becoming more common. They're transforming the way cities were made and how America was traveling. So in 1916, the Wilson administration passed an act creating the U.S. highway system. All the U.S. highways, all those ones with the little black and white signs with the white shield, the numbers on it, that's the U.S. highway system. It was created by the Wilson administration. The way we define it has to be a 50-50 split between the U.S. government and the states. So feds pay 50%, states pay 50%. And you have this system of paved highways developing across this country. They're the federal highways, safe, modern highways. But in fact, the highway here outside the room is a U.S. highway. It's a business route, but it should be a U.S. highway paid half by federal, half by the state. But of course, federal highways like this, the U.S. highway system, they can be very many different things. It can be these small 2-lane blacktops like US 82 is for much of the way out here across most of South Arkansas. It could be basically on practically the size of interstate. These big, wide lanes, limited access, or speed with 2-lane blacktop or anything in between. In fact, you go down US 82 further west, areas like Sherman, Texas, and Wichita Falls, Texas, it's a 6-lane divided highway at limited access. You can only get on or off by exits. Again, they had a lot more traffic out there. Probably one of the most long-lasting reforms was the Federal Reserve Act. Passed in 1913. Basically, it's an attempt to try to strengthen the banking system. As you may recall from the first half of U.S. history, Congress had tried to create a Bank of the United States on several occasions in order to try to find a safe basically try to find a safe place for the U.S. government to deposit its money and a way that would help the United States develop a financial infrastructure to facilitate development across the country. So after the Civil War, there had been talks sometimes creating a third Bank of the United States, even in the 1880s and 1890s. But the result was a compromise and through bipartisan support was the Federal Reserve Act, creating the Federal Reserve System. What it did was it revolutionized the banking industry, protecting thousands of banks from failure, basically acting as a banker's bank. Set up 12 regional banks owned and controlled by banks in the district. Basically be a combination of federal and private control. Federal Reserve Boards in the different banking districts. One's Houston, Texas, Bank in Houston, one's San Francisco. You can see on the dollar bill the different Federal Reserve banks, whichever those were public or money was printed. New York, Philadelphia, Houston, excuse me, not Houston, but Dallas. Houston and Dallas are fighting for it, but Dallas ended up winning out. San Francisco, so forth. These 12 regional banks, except they have a board of directors, a combination of private, controlled proportionally by private banks and also by the federal government. Now, the Federal Reserve Bank would do is it hold a portion of a bank's assets in trust. That is, every day, whenever banks are down to this day for their deposits, they take a portion of cash on hand and send it to the Federal Reserve Bank, safekeeping it. The Federal Reserve basically credits them for what they deposited in the Federal Reserve Bank. And the federal government would use these, the Federal Reserve would use these money reserves to support loans to other banks at discounted bank rates set by the Federal Reserve. So basically, you have banks A, B, C, and D in a district, and they're all basically under the jurisdiction of the Federal Reserve. They take a portion of their assets to send to the Fed. But if one of these banks is weak or about to fail, the Federal Reserve can take money and send it to one of these banks to give it strength until it stabilizes, basically preventing it from failing. The collective strength of these other banks helping the weaker banks survive. Now, how much money these banks have to send in, what percentage of their assets they have to send in, that's determined by the Federal Reserve Board. Basically, that's how they determine interest rates is they're determining the price of the loan interest rates. How much you can send into the Fed versus how much you keep. Fed even sending some back, depending on just what are they going to charge for loans. At that, the Federal Reserve regulating interest rates this way, it creates a common, stable interest rate across the country. It only varies just a couple of percent depending on the bank. So stable interest rates, stable banks, which means individuals in the industry now had a stable money supply, a stable banking system to do business with across the country. And they also set up the Federal Reserve Note, which became the country's basic currency. In fact, look on all your money, all your dollar bills, all it says on the top of it, Federal Reserve Note. In fact, in the old days, they had what's called a silver note certificate. You take a dollar, silver note certificate to the Federal Reserve Bank, wherever it was, say New York or Chicago, wherever else, and you get a dollar's worth of silver for handing them that silver note certificate. But, interestingly enough, like I say, these Federal Reserve notes, cash currencies, what these banks are sending back to the Fed, and the Fed's sending back. So you have a stable currency, reducing the problems of counterfeiting. So to shift funds quickly, they need to protect troubled banks or to meet increased demands for credit. All national banks are required to join the Federal Reserve under the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, which meant any bank doing business across state lines. Most state banks ended up joining later. Well, by 1914, 50% of all American banks were in the Federal Reserve system. In the late 1920s, nearly 80% of banks, creating a stable system of finance for the country, basically saving a lot of banks, and keeping a lot of banking customers from losing all their money. So these are some of the reforms that Wilson had managed to accomplish, but the latter part of his term, though, is going to be dominated by the issues of World War I. They're putting the test as a progressive idealism and the idealism of the country, facing a huge worldwide war. That's it.